Sometimes people say that I treat the memory palace like a hammer for all the nails relating to learning, and it's a fair criticism if you're looking at what I do at the surface level. And I criticize myself. I mean, it's hard to shut my brain off on the topic of memory at large, let alone the memory palace. Every time the word memory comes up in a movie or a novel, I'm supposed to be relaxing, but the deeply trained procedure of inquiring into the nature of memory always seems to try to weave together some new video or podcast so I can have yet another excuse to wax mnemonic about some detective novel I might have been reading or the like. Now enter House of Sleep by Brad Kelly. Here's a novel about memory very directly and in a unique and incisive way.
The mind is an ocean, is it not? Set aside your psychometrics and fMRIs and just feel the epic slosh within your head. They never taught you that metaphors are magic, did they? The problem is that you've forgotten. But it is okay, my child. It's almost never too late. I'm here to remind you, to remind everyone. See, I dive into it every day, leaping from an impossible cliff while my sleepers build, brick by brick, the kingdom that we will share. I pierce the waters, the metaphorical, the actual, and I hold my breath for longer than a mere mortal is allowed. You don't believe in anything anyway, right? What all could there be to lose?
I'm not going to bore you with all kinds of plot details and summaries because it can be frustrating to listen to people talk about books they haven't read, but Kelly's House of Sleep, and why I'm featuring it, is because it shows memory in multiple dimensions by exposing its power of both inner terror and total self-redemption to the point of enlightenment. It's also very simply about a kind of dream memory clinic where people take a drug under the guidance of a guru with very questionable origins, and the stakes are especially high because memory, as far as I can tell and what I feel intuitively and intellectually, is what we are. We are literally the quality of our memory itself, and we have reasons to believe that because when we're in grief, the quality of our memory is locked to what we're in grief about, and that's part of the theme of House of Sleep. There's just a lot going on that's really wonderful, but compact and tight in this novel, and there's characters who have to learn to use language or develop language, while others have to unlearn everything they think they know about the world or their attachments to the world. So, to talk about memory at large, not just in House of Sleep, and in no way to give undue spoiler alerts, Brad Kelly joins me on this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. And it's really cool because Brad's a pro tarot reader as well, and we get into that. In fact, Brad even gives the entire Magnetic Memory Method project a reading that gives a sample of his skills. But I should also mention that Brad Kelly is the co-host of a podcast about the murkier aspects of creativity, which I think partly comes up in this tarot reading, the murky aspects that I feel and sometimes go in fear of with the project that I work on. Anyway, his podcast is called Art of Darkness. It's with Kevin Kautzman, and I highly recommend it. I find it like what I miss from university, these deep dives into novels, and it has this very, very specific lens on what might not be the most palatable aspects of creativity and how various highly successful, or at least very unique, sometimes underground people, how they dealt with their darkness. And House of Sleep is also, as I mentioned, got some darkness in it when it comes to memory, but I think it's ultimately redemptive. So Kelly's novel, his card divination, and his podcasting all get a thumbs up from me. So I hope you'll hit the thumbs up on this discussion as well. If you're new here and you're not subscribed to my project, then please get subscribed because I've got many big old memory hammers for every nail that your memory has to deal with. And I promise more than one kind of hammer in the toolbox is coming. And we sure as shampoo haven't covered them all yet. So without further ado, welcome Brad Kelly, who you can find for more details about House of Sleep and his other projects at bradkellyesque.com. Brad, thanks for joining me. I'm super excited about House of Sleep because I always find memory comes up in like every book that I read, but it's pretty rare that there's a novel that's literary, but not literary at the expense of not having a story, because there's a really strong plot here, but there's language, there's meditations on consciousness, and there is an ending that is very beautiful about what memory can be, and it's actually quite lovely. The notion of how everything resolves around memory. So maybe just a little bit about yourself, and how do you come to write such an extraordinary book with these preoccupations that I am so into: memory, consciousness, and really, I think, words as images in a way, and images as sensations in a visual world that's just so super saturated to the point that what we see doesn't mean as much as it used to.
Yeah, well, yeah. Thanks for having me, and I'm so glad House of Sleep resonated with you. I've been blessed to have a number of people, a few more all the time, who seem to really have House of Sleep has meant something to them, and so that is that's humbling, and I'm very proud of that. Yeah, House of Sleep and the things you're saying about it, I always love it when I talk to somebody and like I feel like they got it, and that's really cool. It's funny writing a book sometimes, or a story. People read it, and I'm kind of like, I hope it makes sense at all to them. Like it's just not gibberish, right?
Right.
So that's great. It came out of I've written, this is the only novel I have sort of available and out there, but I've written other novels that sort of didn't go anywhere, and I kind of gave up on them, frankly. And the process is always this like kind of accretion of details about sort of phenomena, and then people and characteristics and situations, until eventually you're kind of like, oh, I mean, I have like a notebook where I just jot down individual sentences, just something that struck me. And eventually they kind of, you realize, oh, this one kind of goes with this one. And I couldn't even tell you rationally why two necessarily go together. It's like and sort of an analogy. If you put the two together, they hum kind of, and they're like, oh, well, for some reason that those two work together. So we'll see if we can make those fit together. Um, so some of the things that kind of led to House of Sleep. House of Sleep, for people who haven't read it, it's it's a story told through kind of three perspectives. The primary one is, well, people could disagree. The primary one I think of is the character Daniel, who's a young man who's afflicted with a never quite understood illness, never quite understood by him, and due to that, or at the same time, simultaneous with that, he's been confined to a very remote home with a father who's frankly schizophrenic, I would say, even though I don't think the book actually uses that word. And finally, he finds his way out. So kind of all the issues you might imagine for somebody who has been kept from the world, what it would be like for them to enter the world. And he's trying to find his older brother who has left the farm years before. Not only does he have this illness, which is kind of mysterious even to him, he also seems to have some unique insights. And he has an obsession with words, because one of the only things he's had is the dictionary.
Right.
And then there's a woman named Lynn. Lynn has lost her fiance in an accident. She is trying to mourn, trying to get some closure on that. And both of these characters find themselves at the House of Sleep, which is sort of a retreat center where people are having the experience of remembering their dreams as if they happened yesterday, and they're kind of doing it together. And it's over time it is developed into something like a collective experience. And then the third perspective is the man who leads this place, who just goes by the Diving Man, guy who has some interesting characteristics. Maybe we'll get into it. For me, the variety of things that came from it is, I had a relationship with someone who had a very serious illness, Lyme disease, had all kinds of strange effects that didn't necessarily even make sense and changed all of the time. It was if you didn't know any of the science behind it, it would seem very, very strange, the kinds of symptoms and what would lead to what. And I was kind of sort of inspired by that in maybe a morbid kind of fashion about that lived experience and having seen that. Um, and then the House of Sleep itself, the practice that's going on there, it actually was inspired by um, uh, people who listen to your show may know him. Maybe you do. Terrence McKenna,
Yeah, yeah.
in a lecture, just as a toss off, he once said, I think the drug that they should invent would be a drug that makes you remember your dreams. I thought,
Mm.
oh well, yeah, what if? Because I have
Right.
a very vivid dream life and I remember very little of it, right? I remember
Mm.
scant images and things. But yeah, what if you actually remembered them, right? So eventually, again, putting these pieces together, how do you fit all of these things together? And then for a time, I was very involved in a certain sort of segment of what I guess you would call the New Age community. I was attending ayahuasca ceremonies fairly regularly, and that kind of inspired the milieu of the House of Sleep, the kinds of
Okay.
people that were attracted to it, the things that they were going through, the reasons they sought it out, and then just generally how people related to each other in that kind of environment. So kind of piecing all of those things together. And yeah, eventually years later, House of Sleep pops out the other end. So
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, that's good. And it's interesting to hear you describe the nature of the story and the pieces that revolve around each other,
Yeah.
because it just sort of stress tests and like, yeah, that's what I remember.
Yeah.
But I
Right.
love that idea of, disease and this young person who really has to build a vocabulary. I mean, there are scenes where dictionaries are read and this kind of thing, but also there's a thing where mourning is a kind of, rather than just a healthy thing that happens when you lose somebody, mourning is
Mm-hmm.
treated as kind of a disease that has no solution. And almost one step further, I mean, I never thought of Terrence McKenna until you said it now,
Yeah.
because the image that I have for Diving Man is just so far from that in my mind.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, there's a kind of sense that that character treats consciousness as a disease that needs to be wiped out. Like
Oh,
it's well, I mean, it's got all these kind of spiritual tones, and it's like he's speaking the language of samsara as the wheel of suffering, and then nirvana as the way out of this, and non-duality and no separation. Like it's got exactly like you say, this
yeah.
ayahuasca sort of
Yeah.
self-help new agey kind of thing to it, but there's a sinister pulse to it all, as if
Sure.
consciousness is a disease. uh
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a line there that's something along the lines of it's either going to be catastrophe or apotheosis, or maybe
Right.
both
Right.
at the same
Yeah.
time. Which I thought was,
Right. Right.
that extraordinary,
Yeah.
that would be the resolution of consciousness, really, is catastrophe and apotheosis all at once. I
All at the
maybe,
same
I
time.
don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think there's a sense, as not a person who's particularly enlightened, I guess, for lack of a better term, that there is there would be a sense of catastrophe in that happening. I think. Not that I have any idea what it would be like for that to happen, but like for instance, in the tarot, which I read tarot and I study tarot, uh, there's a card, the death card comes in the middle of what we call the fool's journey. It doesn't come at the end. And it's this severing that is required to happen for you to grow. And it's traumatic. And I think
Mm.
most people, at least once you've attained a sort of certain amount of years, and some people it happens quite young, you have something in your life that's incredibly traumatic and catastrophic, and you wouldn't want anybody else to go through it. But at the end, it's sort of like, I wouldn't be who I am without that. And I sort of needed that on some level.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah. And I think that's one thing that sort of in the spiritual community, there can be a sort of a glossing over that. Like this might be painful. You might have to let parts of yourself wither away or die. And you may kind of like them or at least be comfortable with them. Yeah. So yeah, that's all in there, I think.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear you say that you don't feel or think of yourself as particularly enlightened. And I would just convince you otherwise if I can, with my own theory of consciousness and what it means to be enlightened. I mean, I think everybody is 100% enlightened all the time, right? Like, how could you be
Okay.
otherwise? And that to me seems kind of like the good, virtuous part of what this person's message is. And as I'm reading the book, I'm like, damn, this guy's like switched on. Like, he understands
Yeah.
you as the author. You
Mhm.
understand what you're playing with, and that's why it comes through. So when you say, "Oh, I'm not enlightened," my own theory is, if you're conscious, like, what is consciousness other than 100%? Like, even when you're asleep, to go with
Mm.
the theories of the dream, even if you forget you're dreaming,
Mhm. Mhm.
where does the dream appear except for in consciousness, which never leaves, right? It's just
Yeah.
100%. So
Yeah. Yeah.
if you're alive,
Yeah.
you're
Okay.
conscious, or
Okay.
you're
All right.
enlightened.
I'm gonna take the credit for that. That's good.
I put my foot
Yeah.
down on this.
Yeah.
If you
Okay.
if you're alive, you're enlightened.
I like this. I
This
like
is
this. Well, that's a certain there is a certain encouraging aspect to that, right? But
mm,
you know, I guess my head, I hear the term enlightened, I think of uh the sort of almost the strictly Buddhist sense where you're sort of beyond all attachment, right?
all right,
I'm
right.
certainly not beyond attachment. I'm beyond a few of them maybe, but I'm certainly very attached. So
Have you ever heard the
yeah,
story of the 13th monk?
I don't think so. No.
So, when we think about the Buddhist and beyond attachment and all that sort of stuff, after the Buddha dies, 12 monks get together. They basically write out everything they think that they remember that he said.
Mhm.
They're congratulating themselves, patting themselves on the shoulder. And the 13th monk comes in, he looks over the documents and he says, "Well, already, but it's not the way I remember it." Basically, he's calling fraud on all of this thing, right? He's killing the Buddha.
Right.
He meets the Buddha and he
Right.
kills him immediately, because it comes back to that sort of thing. If you're alive, you're attached. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
life is. It's the attachment
Yeah.
to the body. And so, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, that's very true. And I think, I mean, this is one of the things that's about literature to me and about stories and narratives is there is a sense if you had a character who wasn't attached to anything in that Buddhist sense, it's not a particularly interesting story. I mean,
mm,
I can imagine an interesting story where they get to the end, maybe, and that's some kind of place they end up. But along the way, that's where all of the drama in a story and the interesting drama in a life happens too, is these wants and these desires, and they're met and they're not met, and you're striving for them, you're running away from them. That's where all of the kind of dirty
yeah.
luster of being a human being actually is.
Well, is there, you said having had some attachment, so to speak, or interest
Mhm.
with New Age stuff. Is
Mhm.
there more of a story behind that, beyond Terence
Yeah.
McKenna, that's
Yeah.
interesting?
I'm
Because it seems
yeah.
like you've really lived with this stuff. I mean, or is it just that you just kind of like combing the internet and like, oh, here's a cool word. Like, to me,
No,
it
no,
really
it
comes
yeah,
across
it's
as a lived journey with some of these concepts.
yeah, it certainly is. And yeah, when I said I was sort of involved in like an aspect of the New Age community, it wasn't as a like a journalist or an anthropologist. I mean, it was certainly as a participant. Um, you know, as a young man, I was as like a teenager into my early 20s, I was fairly atheistic and materialist in the sense of like this is all there is. And then had some, and I couldn't even tell you what the draw of it was, but it had some experiences with psychedelics in my early 20s. And then that kind of fell out of my life for a while and years went by. And then eventually kind of stumbled back into it and had been reading and hearing about, excuse me, about ayahuasca and, sort of gestating on it. And eventually the opportunity presented itself and kind of going into that for anybody who's had that experience. I don't necessarily recommend it unless it's sort of you feel like drawn to it, um, which I did. You come out the other end, and if you go into it very rigidly materialistic, you come out the other end really having to reckon with some things.
Mm.
Um, and not to be dogmatic about what anybody should believe about anything, but certainly you're going to be you're going to be given some evidence that requires you to wrestle with it. Maybe you end up just as rigidly atheistic after that, but there's going to be I've in half joking terms I've related that to like yeah, there's a lot of conversation about UFOs now, but if one landed on the neighbor's yard and an alien walked out, you'd have to sit there and figure out, well, what do I think about that? Like what was that? And that's what that experience kind of in terms of a cosmological belief structure was for me. So I'm still kind of wrestling with that. It opens the door and kind of invites you in, but doesn't really give you a map. So
Well,
yeah.
how much do you remember of the experience? Do you have an expansive sense of time, or is it fragmentary?
Oh, and like within it, is there an expansive experience of time?
Well, I mean,
Like within the experience?
th- this is always the question. I mean, I have my own experiences, so I'm kind of curious.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an opposite kind of conclusion. If anything, I've become an uber atheist, which
Okay.
has some nuance to it. But in any
Sure.
case, that doesn't necessarily exclude alternatives to materialism. But nonetheless,
Mm-hmm.
I have to wonder, as a person who knows maybe too much for my own good about what memory is, and not like imposing, here's the science of memory
Yeah.
upon a person. But it's just like when we think about those experiences, how much actually happened as opposed to what we elaborate and then create as our memory of what happened. And
Right.
perhaps if you've had multiple experiences, how the mind might or the memory might knit and weave those things together into a larger portrait. So I'm just
Yeah.
asking, like, what confidence you have in your memory of what happened, in the same way that if you did see a UFO,
Right.
how soon is it going to be before Scully and Mulder are just kind of like changing your memory of the event because they're
Right.
slipping in these words that knit in and weave in with the experience.
No, that's a very good point, and that's I think part of the wrestling process too. It's sort of like, and yeah, I had multiple experiences, in very carefully prepared and monitored scenarios with people who had been working with this stuff for years and years and years, and there is an aspect of they are all knitted together. There's the sensation of it for me was like this experience was always happening underneath the surface, and then this just allowed me to like dip into it, and so I
Yeah.
can't it's hard to distinguish what happened in any one of them.
Right.
And to your point, the memories of the specifics of the memories are very dreamlike. There's vast swaths of time I don't remember, and then um there's very dramatic or vibrant moments, vivid moments that I do remember. And there's an aspect of those that are like, I think about my memories of childhood, and the stuff I remember the most is stuff that there happens to be photos of. And that's because periodically I've seen that photo and kind of
Right.
reconstructed that experience, and how close is my memory of it now to what actually happened. Who's to say? I'm kind of tailoring it all to that photograph. So some of it's like that. There's experiences in there that I've recounted to myself or to other people, and those tend to be the strongest. But yeah, there is a sense of which, like, and this is part of the wrestling with it. Things like, how did that actually happen? Did that actually happen? Am
Right,
I
right, right.
misremembering it? Am I telling myself that's what it is? Are my post hoc interpretations washing out some of the important details of what was actually going on? It's tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the theme that you're working with in House of Sleep, or at least as I interpret it. I mean, it's got a very
Mm-hmm.
kind of Heart of Darkness Kurtz feeling in some sense, and there's a propagandistic element where the people have to sell themselves on it, and they
Mm-hmm.
tell each other what's going on and so forth, which reinforces the idea that there's going to be a oneness, or a release of these memories. As memory gets stronger and stronger, you're able to release these other unwanted memories, and it's just it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a paradox that folds in on itself. And
Yes.
I don't
Yes.
necessarily have a way to go from that in terms of another questioning point. But when you mentioned this idea of like your memory having more to do with photographs that you've seen. That's kind of an interesting point in memory, because there's a thing called highly superior autobiographical memory. And in some of the studies, they show that a lot of people are really into themselves. And there's even a documentary boy who has superior memory, and he's just got endless photographs of himself on the wall in his bedroom.
Right.
He's like looking at himself all day long. But anyway, in the terms of the way that House of Sleep is structured, the area that people are at, they're meeting each other all the time, and they're just kind of like constantly having run in with the same message that reinforces it and deepens it again and again and again, which is kind of like what we do with tarot as well. It's just like a spaced repetition machine of figures and images. But before we get into tarot, one of the things I really like in House of Sleep is use of imagery. Seems very elemental, water, sun, earth, sky, that kind of stuff. But also there's a theme that comes up literally in the words, like the idea that sensation and image or imagery and sensation are kind of getting too blurred, and they're not as distinct as they used to be. Or I mean, another way of thinking about it is, and it's also just the way you write, like the sun, like there's this sense of the sun being unbruised, right? Which has, I mean, I think that's literally the word, like they use an unbruised sun, which is an image, but it's nothing you could ever really see because you can't look at the sun. So you have to like kind of like feel what would be like to bruise the sun in order to have the image of an unbruised sun. Like it's that sort of richness. So that leads me to ask things like, to what extent do images from tarot, etc., inform what you're doing, or how do you write? I mean, how much of that comes up in the second draft where you're just doing like a skeleton and then you're adding shades of color, or is that your primary style, or what are you thinking when you come up with such great ideas like an unbruised sun?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm so glad you keyed in on the language, because that's something that I think a lot of, I mean, part of the reason that Daniel is obsessed with words is because he's sort of an exaggeration of me, right? So, and I just thinking on words for a minute, to me, they are a limiting thing. There's things that words struggle to describe or explain. Everybody's had that thing that they can't put into words, right? And yet at the same time, to me, they're kind of magic, really. I mean, they're means of like, we think of telepathy as like speaking directly mind to mind, but like I can sort of get you to understand what's going on in my mind by making kind of arbitrary seeming sounds, right? There is something strange about that. But then also naming things consolidates them out of the blurriness that makes them distinct. So there's, to me, there is like a magical quality to words. I'm also like a believer that actually no two words mean the same thing. I know we have synonyms, but even if they have the same dictionary definition, two different words always feel different in a sometimes hard to describe way. And so there's also these sort of psychic, not to overuse the word, but kind of psychic resonances to words. They feel a certain way. Some words we all have different memory associations with, like we've heard them at different times in our lives and different contexts, and so they land a little bit differently. But in terms of like the writing process, it is pretty. I'm a multiple. I'm working on a novel now, and I'm coming close to a draft. Some of the chapters have been drafted 10 or 15 times at this point. And you kind of have to like listen. For me, you kind of have to listen to the writing a novel is part of the reason it's fascinating to me, and I think I'll always be fascinated with the process. Is there's a part of your mind that's the inspired part, the sort of free spirit. I had a mentor once who said you have to be, one half just freewheeling, free-spirited, creative type, and then you have to be the other side. You have to be either like a drill sergeant or like a harsh grammar school matron, right? Like you have to
Right.
like crack that, you have to be willing to crack the ruler. And so sometimes I can be in either one of those states. Sometimes I just have to say, okay, I not really feeling like the flow state thing. So I'm just going to get something on the page. This is going to be what happens. And then later I'll come back and maybe I'll be able to feel it. Maybe I'll be able to feel like that more poetic impulse and make the language more interesting. And then usually a side effect of that is it's just more enjoyable aesthetically to read.
Right.
So I'm kind of using whichever part of my brain has shown up that day.
Mm.
And you're not always in charge of it either, right? You don't get to decide. There is, I mean, I do kind of believe in this notion of there being a sort of a muse, but you don't get to decide if she shows up that day. So,
Unless
so
you're
you
Stephen
show
King.
up. Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. I don't know how that guy does it. I the level of productivity there is insane. But so sometimes you don't get to decide. Like you show up and you're like, I just don't feel anything. I don't got anything going on. And so a, a writer who was an early inspiration to me, Henry Miller, he said, you can't always write, but you can always work. And
Mm.
so sometimes it's like, well, I can't seem to get this page down, but like maybe I can go back to another part. Maybe I can think through the structure a little bit. Maybe I can, go back through my notes and see if there's something I missed,
Mm.
which is interesting. I have a notebook and I write in it thinking about what I'm working on at the time. And sometimes I flip back through it. I'm like, oh, I forgot I had a whole idea about how to do this that I have since forgotten it. And I'm glad it's written down. So it is kind of it's a mercurial process. I think the only thing that's like true always is there's there's momentum and inertia at play.
Mm.
And if you're doing it every day, it's easier. The muse shows up more frequently. If you
Right.
stop for a while, it's much, much harder to get kind of back on track. And so there's all these ways of sort of tricking yourself into
Right.
into doing the thing. Yeah.
Mm.
I hope that answers your question. I know I'm kind of
Yeah, no,
spitballing
no,
here,
that's
but
that's
yeah,
good stuff. It gets
yeah,
into the things that are involved in writing that have to do with memory. So poke into that
mhm,
a little bit, but just
yeah,
to comment on something, I think you're right. You can have a thesaurus and say, oh well, it means the same thing, but the sound conditions a lot. And I don't know what you think about this, but I lived in Europe for the better part of 10 years and
okay.
mostly in Germany, but I also did my second MA in Switzerland. So
Oh wow.
one thing I observed there is that they have a love of language, specifically their own language, that we
Yeah,
just, I mean, I shouldn't say we, I'm Canadian, but, and I think you're in the States,
yep.
but maybe close to Canada. If I,
I am. I'm in the Detroit area, so
right.
Canada's right over there. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're in the one area where Canada is actually south of you, isn't that the case?
Yeah, parts of it are. Yeah, yeah, it's
That's
funny.
kind of weird.
And sometimes there's a part of my normal
Windsor, I
drive I
think,
do that sometimes I pick up Canadian like my cell phone dies because it's picking up Canadian
right, right,
towers. Yeah.
right.
So
Anyway, when
we're
I
pretty
say
close.
when I say we, like, there's a kind of North American like overwhelming disregard of language. What
Mhm.
that in Europe, there's just absolute pride in
Mm.
the exact wording, the exact sounding. Even in the English of Britain, you'll still hear people who will roll their R's, right, in English,
Oh yeah.
right? There's
Yeah.
so I think in North America, my memories, we just lost that absolute finickiness of this word and not that word,
Hmm.
even though our
Yeah.
language is abundant with so many words. I think SET has the
Yeah.
most definitions in the dictionary or the average dictionary. It's
It,
like it can
I
mean
can
so
think of a
many things.
bunch. Yeah. 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 No, we have all these great little there's a great uh bit from an interview with Jorge Luis Borges,
Oh yeah.
um, author of some of the most incredible short stories. Um, and if people haven't read them, they're easy. Most of them are like 5 pages, so
And a
dip
lot of
into
them have
the
to do with memory too.
They do. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 The Don Quixote one, and a lot of them do.
Mhm.
What's the Funes the Memorious?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, he talks about Borges, who, he's an Argentine and he grew up speaking both English and Spanish. He was sort of asked to talk about the differences between English and Spanish. And so I'm not making a judgment here, but this is what Borges said, being somebody who was born in both of them, that English, one of the reasons that he thought that English was better for poetry and drama and literature was that English draws from both the Latin and like the Old English. And so we tend to have two words for kind of everything. And it allows a lot more flexibility. Like we have the word ghost and spirit, and
Mhm.
they don't mean exactly the same thing. They're sort of interchangeable, but they both have a different, both have a different cast to them. They both feel a little bit differently. I mean,
Mhm.
I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I remember we referred to it as the Holy Ghost. And at some point, somebody called it the Holy Spirit. I was like, that doesn't ring the same bell for me.
Holy
Like,
Spectre, that would be great.
right,
James Bond theme.
right, right. And then
Holy Spectre, Batman.
I like that. I like he's got a cape. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I just
Oh,
couldn't
it's
resist.
okay. I like that. And one note just on this Borges thing, he also said that the English, as opposed to Spanish and presumably other languages, I don't really have any other languages. Um, he said that, we have a lot greater prepositional flexibility in English, which allows us to have things like, we can say stand up, stand down,
Mm,
stand there. There's just, and they have these slight poetic changes in how they feel, like or live up to and live down. Those are two very different things, right? And it's just that twist of the preposition. And
mm.
according to him, Spanish doesn't quite have that level of flexibility. So I'm an English, I love the English language.
Yeah,
I would
yeah, I
love
do
to
too.
be fluent in something else, but there's the English language is sort of bottomless.
It is. Yeah, and I'm glad I did get fluent in other languages or studied lots of languages. It certainly has helped, but there's so much richness just in English. It's astonishing how
Mm-hmm.
how deep it is as a language. Um,
Yeah.
so about writing and keeping notes and that sort of thing. Do you do
Mhm.
anything like initiatory or that you have to repeat? Just by way of example, I'm working on the sequel to my first memory detective novel, which
Oh, cool.
is like super niche. So niche I didn't even put it on
Yeah.
Amazon because people would be like, why is this detective always using memory techniques? And like going on about it for paragraphs at a time. But anyway,
That sounds cool to
I'm
me.
working on
Yeah.
the sequel and I got through 3 versions of it. And I'm just like, why the hell is this not coming together? And I realized that the first one was written to the point of OCD, listening to the
Mm.
same album over and
Oh
over and
yeah.
over again. Right. And then
Yeah.
so now I put the same album on over and over again. And 30 days later, I'm finally getting somewhere with version 4.
Yeah.
But do you have anything like
Yeah.
that where you have initiation or you have to have certain music on or
Yeah. I mean, I do have certain things that I do every morning. I don't know. My writing practice is, I get up at about 4 o'clock in the morning when everybody else is asleep in the house, and I write until noise starts happening, basically.
right?
So I have, a sequence of sort of getting the day started practices. I don't know how much they're to do with writing. But the writing wise, I do, and I've started this in the last year. I take about the first 5 minutes and I just free write. And usually I'll write about if something's bothering me. I'll try to remember, some detail that happened the day before, if there was something that seems worthy of note. Maybe sometimes it's a story idea, like I don't know what this is, but here's a little thing that I am interested in. Um, and if I can't do that, I will force myself to write a haiku. Um, and they're not good, and they're not meant for, like, you'll never see Brad Kelly's collection of haikus. They're like not even meant for that at all.
You have to do a
They're
Kafka and get him burned successfully.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah. they're just meant to concentrate. I'm trying to like wrangle everything and point it in a very specific direction. And the haiku is like this highly constrained form, you know, five syllables, seven syllables, five syllables. And if you can get all of the stray thoughts and processes going focused enough to get that down, then I feel like I've sort of locked and loaded into the chamber to work for, you know, however long I'm going to be able to work.
Right, right.
So yeah, those are probably the only real ones, you know. And I've got some other, you know, I burn some incense and I get super caffeinated and a couple other things.
Caffeine is definitely a technique.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
uh, so I want to hear a little bit about what it is you're doing as an author. So I know there's the Art of Darkness podcast, which I don't know how much
Yeah.
it has to do with you being an author. It seems to me like this beautiful series of graduate seminars that
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I like
Yeah.
to listen to them and then just reminisce on my university days, which I miss very much.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have to miss them nearly as badly.
Yeah.
Thanks to that podcast. But
Oh, good.
like, where do you see yourself as an author in this time? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
thinking too of a tweet you sent out, and I didn't memorize it, but it had something along the lines of like, you know, what it would take to be full-time author. And I'm curious because I'm technically a full-time author, but I do a heck of a lot of video and podcasting,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So it's just
Right.
like, what is your image? And I think I read that you have won a grant at some point for writing. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
like that's Cormac McCarthy level in my mind.
Yeah. No,
I've had
yeah.
grants in my day, but they were for academic writing.
Mhm.
But you know, the idea of getting writing to do literature.
Yeah. It's
So
pretty incredible.
what's your image in
Yeah.
your mind of like having quote unquote made it? Uh,
Yeah, it's so tricky because you know, if you look at a lot of the careers of people who I think have made it, and you know, some of those are names that people who read a lot are going to know, and some of them maybe aren't. Um, Very, very few of them are making a living strictly off writing. It's never been easy to do. And it seems to be perhaps even harder now than it has been in the past to just strictly, I write books, you know, and I make a living off of it. And the people who do tend to have this kind of superhuman productivity, like a Stephen King. And even though I can be kind of snobbish, I actually have a lot of respect for Stephen King. I think when he hits, he's incredible, actually, as a storyteller.
and oddly enough, he can have passages in books that really hit, and the whole thing
Yeah,
sucks except for like,
right.
you know, part one or part three or
Yeah.
what have you.
Right. Yeah,
But I
that's
probably
true.
that's
That's true
he's not
too.
exclusive in that in
Yeah,
that realm.
yeah. Nobody hits a home run every time up to the plate, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, to me, it's, you know, so kind of backing up, you said I won a grant. I got an MFA, Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from University of Texas. As a Michener Fellowship. So the writer James Michener had made a bunch of money in his day. He was one of the most popular writers of his day, and he didn't
Big
have
books
any.
too.
Yeah, big thick books. South Pacific was, I think, maybe the most famous, but he wrote these sort of almost totalitarian historical fiction pieces where he would just name the South Pacific, and that's what the thing is about, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, super talented guy. And they used to be like, if you went to the average home in the Midwest, if they had a book, it was probably a James Michener book. He didn't have any errors, and so he established this fellowship program at the University of Texas, and I was blessed to go there for 3 years. And you know, coming out of that, the image you had in your head was like, you kind of looked around at the professors and what they were doing, and it was like, okay, well, you'll publish a novel every 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You'll teach. And you know, every once in a while you'll get paid to write an introduction to something or a review, or you'll place a short story or whatever, and maybe some other grants will, you know, you will get a grant here or there. None of that happened. Unfortunately, or fortunately, but at the time it didn't feel very fortunate. And so what I guess I've been trying to do since then is recreate that existence on my own terms. And so that has meant Art of Darkness is a passion project. Me and a friend of mine, the playwright Kevin Kautzman, who I met at the University of Texas. We have a podcast where we talk about we give the full life story of artists who we respect and admire. And I guess the sort of selling point is we don't gloss over the dark aspects of their lives. And many artists we've found have areas of darkness in their life, whether it's something inflicted on them, whether it's something they inflicted on other people. Some sort of demon has, metaphorically speaking, is in their lives. And kind of asking the question is that just coincidence, or is that somehow part of all of this, right? And we don't have the answer to that, but we cover a wide range of people, mostly writers. I just did one on Edgar Allan Poe a little while ago, and just a total genius, absolute tortured person.
There's definitely darkness in Poe.
Yes, yeah, and
filled with
it's
mingled
on the
cream and
page
amber,
too.
I will raise this glass again. Such hilarious visions clamber through the chambers of my brain. Quaintest thoughts and queerest fancies come to life and fade away. What care I how time passes? I am drinking ale today.
I love that.
I mean, that's
nice.
one of the darkest poems I've ever read.
Yeah, yeah, but it's also beautiful, right? It takes you back to a certain. I start having nostalgia for a time I wasn't even alive when I hear that stuff. Yeah, so Art of Darkness is, I guess my attempt to, replace the college professor part of that picture. And then I'm writing every day. House of Sleep came out in 2021. I will have a book ready in 2024. We'll see what happens with that. I don't have any there's nothing sort of on the calendar there about that coming out, and I've got short stories happening all the time. So I guess I'm trying to recreate that existence. Whether or not it, getting to the situation where it sort of pays for life is still a big question mark, right? But maybe I'll be able to figure that out eventually. Yeah.
Oh, I think you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel a great resonance with that, because I've used the exact term that I am symbolically creating my own university that I wound up leaving because of how things were in the spare you the story, or save it for another time. But that's literally what I've done. And I love hearing too, the refreshing thing of, no bad vibes for Stephen King. Because one of the things that happened to me, I used to hang out in the Toronto poetry scene, and I made a vow one day, because I was at one of these readings and someone was up and they were explaining that they were masters of their craft. And that horrid Stephen King, I can't imagine how that he's got this other book out where as the master of my craft, and I looked this person up, and she's teaching creative writing at a university. And I'm like, wait a second. Wouldn't the master of one's craft not have to teach creative writing and so forth? So I made this special magic word, since words are magical, which was craft, spelled CRAPHT. And I had my theory of craft, and I swore I would never write pyrotechnical literature again until that I had written and sold a pot boiler, which I've done.
Interesting.
And rather successfully, actually, even though it's very small, like in my own little memory world, these people really like it. And I made myself write a pot boiler, which means, hero's journey, and exactly where you have the visit to the underworld is where the visit to the underworld happens. And then, the battle and the self-revelation and like all that stuff. I made myself do it. Now I feel
that's awesome. Yeah.
Now I feel like I got a license to go back and call myself a master of the craft with pyrotechnic. But you know what I'm saying? Like,
well,
I love it. I find it very fresh.
No, there's those ultimate craft things about narrative. I love this PHT. I think that's great. I think you have to have those. I mean, you can't see it, but like right there on my wall I have a diagram of the hero's journey with all the stations marked out. And I'm always thinking about it, House of Sleep doesn't if you were to read it, you might not immediately think hero's journey, but if you really like think about all of the stations on there, a lot of them show up in House of Sleep.
Yeah.
Like there's a going to the underworld, right? There's a crossing of the threshold. There's a lot of those elements, and those are very deliberate, because that is the story as old as time. And there are great experimental works that don't care about that stuff that I love and respect, but knowing those nuts and bolts of like, this is how a story works.
Yeah.
I found that I took some screenwriting courses as well through my time, and I realized it wasn't for me, screenwriting specifically, but I learned a whole lot about how do you just structure something to keep a person's attention, right? How do you just like moving from one thing to the next? And if you can do that, then the ultimate test for me is like, does the reader want to turn the page? Do they want to see what happens next? And that could be for intellectual reasons, for poetic reasons, for suspense, for whatever reason, but can you get them to flip that page? And that's like the ultimate test to me, no matter how artistic the thing is.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, you've definitely managed to do that with this book.
Good,
And
good.
as I opened with, like, I was very pleased to see this high literary form. Just forgive that term, but like real literature, but not at the expense of having an actual story. And there's, I mean, in the new Twitter, book tweeting, or I now rechristened it Twixter. Maybe somebody else got to that first, but anyway,
like
I just call
it that
Twixter now. But anyway, I take a risk on these books because they got cool covers or whatever, and so and so said whatever in the blurb or whatever. But usually, it's often just it doesn't have a story. Like they're great technicians of language, but so I appreciate that. And what have you done anything to, other than just writing and reading a lot of stuff, to try to remember what's involved in a plot, or like gone out of your way to remember, to get it in your bone marrow?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because yes, more so on the thing I'm working on now than in previous instances. For the thing I'm working on now, I have a stack of index cards, and there's sort of an index card per not chapter, but per, loosely speaking, per scene. And I have about 12 or 15 elements that I'm trying to keep track of when they show up, so I can chart their progress. And I don't want to give false illusions that like I'm planning all of this ahead of time. This is mostly I plowed through the first draft, and this is now like, okay, what do I have on my hands here?
Yeah.
But it helps me. So each scene, it'll have a little color coded note that, this is when we learn this happened, right? And then maybe it's 3 scenes later, maybe it's 15 scenes later, it's the same color code, and it's what is the next evolution of that thing. It's partially so I can get at a glance the structure of it, what kind of happens where. And then it's also, so frankly, so I can keep track of, did I already say this? Did I already, especially you do this multiple draft things and you're moving stuff around, it can get disorienting about, what am I saying this for the second time? Did he already say this? And if he already said it, should he be saying something that kind of stems off of it, or should I be getting rid of it? So that would be the closest thing I've got to like a memory technique in this, is just trying to boil it down to some essential things I'm keeping track of. And I found that just having the cards, I flip through them occasionally.
I'm with you.
Keeps me, oh, look at you. Okay. All right. Yes. All right. Maybe I'm on the right track then. Yeah.
Yeah, I find index cards for writing books essential, especially nonfiction. But yeah, I have extracted the skeleton out of my own first drafts, put them on cards, move them around, try to really understand what I got on my hands here, and rework it that way. So that's cool.
Totally. Yeah. It's a book is, I mean, it's a complicated beast, 200, 300, 400 pages is a lot of stuff. and it can be hard, to keep. And then one thing I also do too, and this is sort of a memory thing, is periodically I I will pace around in my writing area here, and I will just summarize scene to scene what happens. Just
Mm.
starts here, then this happens, then he does this, and I just up into the point, and I do that up into the point I'm working on right now, and then I'm like,
Mm.
okay, now I know where I'm at. Now I know where he's been. Yeah. So that's kind of a memory technique, I suppose, as
Solvitur
well.
ambulando, as they say in Latin. It is solved by walking.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I think I've worn a groove in the carpet down here for sure. Yeah.
Apparently, Dickens walked and he had a cane that flopped out a notebook and it had like an inkwell on it. And he would just be
Oh,
like,
that's
bam.
pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
Joyce Carol
I,
Oates, apparently, she
yes.
has like some sort of thing, like she'll meet people, journalists or whatever, and she has like a little writing desk outside of her house in case like she's waiting for
Yeah.
them to greet them, and she'll write notes on this. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's true or not, but
It could be, because the legend I've heard about her is that she sort of finishes a draft and then she literally flips it over and starts the next one on the back. Like there's no interruption in her process, which is I kind of aspire to, but I'm not there yet.
so do you think there's breeds of writers or uh, types, or because
Yeah.
Stephen King's like, you got to read, you got to read, you got to read, and Cormac McCarthy was like, I don't read novels, I only read nonfiction.
Right.
So it's like obviously there's some
Yeah.
discrepancy here.
Yeah, I think on the reading thing, I mean, I think Cormac probably, I mean, he, you see interviews with him and stuff, and I think he seems sort of unimposing, but if you're deep into the work, you kind of realize you've got something like a genius on your hands.
Mm.
I think he read, I think he probably actually read pretty widely, at least early on. And he may have been one of those people who just rereads the same thing over and over again. I mean,
Right.
if you pick your desert island books, you might not need to read much more than 4 or 5 if you're really getting to the root of them. I mean, I find reading to be critical, just kind of periodically. um and I read a lot for our show, Our Darkness. I usually read 3 or 4 books at least per episode, so I'm constantly reading stuff. um there is a challenge though of getting overly influenced by any one specific thing that you're reading. um and that can be distracting and a little disorienting, especially if for in my experience, especially like before I had figured out. I mean, they say find your voice, right? And so it sounds maybe a little corny, but it's true that you do, in a way, need to find your voice that's going to work for you, that you can operate in.
Mm.
Um, and until that has happened, it can be really easy to kind of be pulled and pushed by whatever you're reading.
Right.
Um, and now I feel like I'm a little more deliberate about like, oh, I like that from this writer, and I try to take that and integrate it if it's something that I really like. But
The
yeah, I
Spectre,
think
do 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 do,
yeah.
Holy Spectre.
Yeah, yeah. I think for fiction writers, the biggest difference between like types is what does George R. R. Martin call it? Um gardeners, and basically it comes down to, he has a term for it. It's like gardeners or something else. But the basic idea is like people who outline completely, and then people who just kind of start and go. I think that's the big separation. I think both types have something that they could learn from the other one too. So yeah.
No, that's super interesting. I find it's like with the music thing, having to listen to the same album again. I find
Mm-hmm.
that whatever I read poisons or
Mm-hmm.
influences. But I've finished a draft of a book about Giordano Bruno and his memory
Mm-hmm.
techniques. I don't know if you know that guy.
Yeah.
He's next level. But that book, I'm gonna have to revise it probably 15 times to get the Bruno out of it, because as I'm reading Bruno to write it, I just
Mm.
start having these twisty long sentences where I don't even know what the heck I'm talking about. And then when I do my
Yeah.
memory detective fiction stuff, like I have to read Michael Connolly to just kind of like,
Mm.
be more in that dan 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 dan
Right.
dan 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 dan.
Very efficient, very
Um,
compelling, very, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
and even
Yeah.
then, I still have a little bit of my more, shall we say, McCarthy-esque
Mm-hmm.
labyrinthine sentences, and that sort of thing. But yeah, influence
Mm-hmm.
is a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
you ever read The Anxiety of Influence? I think it was
I
Harold Bloom.
have. it's been years, but I have. Yeah.
Oh, I think
Yeah.
we chatted about that actually.
We did a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, what I guess I take away from that, and I'm not even 100% sure if this is his thesis. I mean, there is definitely a just from the title, the anxiety of influence. I think there is a certain uh you don't want to be overly like I don't want something I write to be a person to read it and they can like within a couple sentences like tell me 3 books I've read.
Mm.
Like I don't want that to happen.
Let me see here
Um,
if I can come up with
yeah,
3. No.
right. You
I'll
might
read
be
the
able
tarot
to.
of
I
your
don't
book.
know how. Yeah, I don't know how well I've accomplished this goal, but
Well, it seemed very
at the same
cinematic to me, actually.
okay, that's
Uh,
good. That is definitely something I'm go. We live in the age of cinema. There's no getting around it for sure.
yeah, I think I told
Um,
you I thought more of Odarowski and Cronenberg, maybe a little
mhm,
DeLillo,
yeah,
and maybe a bit of McCarthy, but
yeah,
I was thinking more of cinema when
that's good.
when
That's
I was reading
cool.
it.
Yeah, that's really that's good to hear because that is sort of the goal. I mean, you're trying to make it not that you're trying to write a screenplay or something, but we live in a very cinematic age and that's how people are
Mm,
most commonly experiencing narrative fiction is through films and television. And so there's things that film does better than the written word, obviously.
mm,
And so I want to steal some of that, right? Like, is there a way to frame things that is a little more compelling from film? Yeah, for sure.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
the idea in Bloom that I resonated the most with, or I didn't resonate with it personally, although I think I've seen it in my own career as a writer,
Mhm.
is the idea of symbolically killing your influence, right? And
Yeah.
Ezra Pound has this classic poem, I think it's called A Pact, where he's just like, Whitman, I'm done with you. And then he's like, but we will have commerce in the end. But he's like literally taking an axe to Whitman, and like he just wants that guy out of his out of his mind, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And
Yeah.
I think in a way that you know almost you have to, just for your own ego, because if you're like, I mean, maybe I frame it in the form of a question. Do you ever, because I have this all the time, I read my stuff and I'm just like, how is this so bad? And then I read other things and then it's just like, how is that so good? And why am I still like not writing like that?
Right.
Like you also have to kill your own ego just to get to ship the
Yeah.
final product.
Yeah.
Do you have that struggle, or are you
Y-
or one of those guys that's just
Yeah.
like, this is brilliant, ready to go?
No, 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 no. I mean, this is where the draft after draft after draft after draft comes out. And this is also like uh I don't I don't like to read the thing once it's done. Like
Mm,
I've got some short story. I was just retweeted a short story today because it came out in a Christmas special of Apocalypse Confidential. It's a great literary mag. Came out in a Christmas special last year, and I was like, oh, okay, it's December. Let me send this out. And I started to read it again, and I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Because all I'll do is I'll think about how I would change something, and it's the horse is out of the barn. So
yeah.
let it just be what it is. But during the process, it is funny because it's like you read this stuff and it's like, oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. That's okay. That's okay. Now, like every pass is like a little bit getting closer to being something decent. And in
Mm,
fact, my final draft, the final draft of House of Sleep and the final draft of the novel I'm working on now, um, when I get to what feels like, all right, everything is working the way I want it to, I read it aloud and record it. And then I just listen to it on repeat. And anything that sticks out or annoys me or just makes me cringe, I go back and I find some way to smooth that out. Um, and so it even still there'll be stuff that I don't quite like, but I've at least got the individual sentences are unobtrusive.
yes.
At the very worst, they're unobtrusive. They're not maybe some of them are good, but I hope the goal is that no sentence is like ugh.
That's a good way of
So
thinking about it.
yeah, yeah,
All right. Well, I want to hear a little bit about tarot, because I know you're
sure,
reading tarot. But just before
yeah,
we tie off, just tie off the House of Sleep and
sure,
fiction,
yeah.
I do think it's an extraordinarily well written book, both in the
Thank you
sense
so
of
much.
the actual tone and tenor of the language, but also the story. So, what advice would you have for people who want to write that,
Mm.
you know, they either haven't actually got something finished, or they have got something, maybe those two lines of advice. You haven't got something finished, how do you get finished? And then if you
Mhm.
have gotten it finished, you know, how do you get it out there? How do you have that courage, or
Yeah. I mean,
whatever it is that you need to
yeah,
take
if you
that
haven't,
stab?
y- sure, yeah, if you haven't gotten something finished, I mean, the one thing that I would say is, you know, it's the way that I visualize the process of writing a novel, and a short story is going to be a little bit different, but it's sort of the same thing. The way that I visualize a novel is, and maybe there's some latent violence in my psyche, but like I think of writing a novel as you're basically just leaning on something until it falls over. And I just imagine like a huge edifice that if I just lean on this for long enough, and again, leaning is not a lot of force, right? It's just kind of whatever you've got. You're
Mm.
leaning against it, and eventually it'll tumble over. And I guess what that means to me is like it's a very you have to allow it to be gradual, and you have to be willing to like say here's an example. A year of writing for a half an hour every day is way more powerful than a week where you wrote 3 or 4 hours a day and then you quit for 2 months, right?
Yeah.
That just you got to be develop that patience of just kind of chipping away, chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. Um, so that would be one thing. And then don't be scared of revision. Like I think that's a lesson that I think um it's tricky because in the internet age, everybody wants everything right now. And so and for how easy it is to kind of put stuff out on your own, that I think the tendency is to put stuff out before it's ready. Um, there's real value in taking your time. And also time where you're just sitting there and you're thinking about the book is also writing. So, don't expect every day is going to be, you know, every day is going to be a victory lap. Maybe you're Stephen King out there and, you can have hyper productivity, but I don't think um, most people have that. I had a mentor in graduate school, this guy, Alan Greganis, great writer. He wrote Oldest Living Confederate Widow Tells All. And he said that nobody writes more than 4 hours a day consistently. And if they say that, they're lying to you. I don't know if that's true. I can't write for more than 4 hours a day. I know that. Um, but think about it in smaller units than this. I have to be like 12-hour marathon sessions, right? So that'd be
Yeah.
one thing. And then in terms of putting it out, I have I had some hills to get over on that front myself. Um I think the one thing, and this is it's almost a sort of a negative thing in a way, um, in terms of like getting it out there in the world, whether you're going to send it to agents or send your work to journals or just publish it yourself, whatever route you choose to do, first you have to just accept the fact that very few people are going to read it. That's just
Mm.
a fact. Even successful books, very few people read, right? Like, even the people who win the Pulitzer, you're talking in the tens of thousands, maybe read that book. Maybe more, but usually it's not that many. So first of all, don't worry too much because not that many people are going to read it anyway. Um, Second of all is remember that like, you know, even the greatest names in the history of literature have had haters, have had people that have said their work is terrible, right?
Many
Even
still
Stephen
do.
King. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even Stephen King has got some know-it-all in a poetry reading somewhere talking smack, right? So you're never going to win everybody's heart and
I have to
mind.
say hello to Christian, who watches a lot of these. I hear you complaining about Dostoevsky right now.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Which is,
He's either the best writer of all time or it's absolute dreck. Right. So that's one thing. It's just like there's no chance everybody's gonna like it. Um, And then, I guess the other aspect of that, it kind of goes in this with this taking your time thing. Just if you know that you did everything you could do to it with it,
Mm.
um, you got to have some degree of faith in it, you know. Um, yeah, it's sort of let the ships fall where they may because I did everything that I could do. So yeah.
Right, right. Well, that's a good segue to tarot, because tarot is, it's related to writing in some
Mhm.
sense, but it is that kind of, instant response. Okay, you got some cards, read me, that sort of
Right.
thing. And
Yeah.
you don't get to go back and edit it 50 times or even once,
No.
really. Although, depending on how you play with the tarot and how you connect the cards, you can go, oh, well, now that that card's come up, we have to
Right, right,
recast
right.
what's going on. But what
Mhm.
what's the origin of your interest in the tarot, to the point that you actually offer reading as a professional service?
Yeah, so it started I got a reading on a date. So a woman gave me a reading, and I have to say I wasn't, dismissive of the concept. I didn't really know anything about it, and I didn't I guess I was kind of tarot neutral, and so I was like, all right, well, this is a first date. So anything that can be like, well, we'll connect on something you're into. That'll be a good way to spend 5 or 10 minutes. Um and she gave me a reading, and at the end I had goosebumps, and I was like in an emotional state. And I just thought, how did that work? Why did that work? What did she just do? Like, what is this? Um, and it took me a little while after that, maybe another year or so, before I bought a deck. And I bought a deck, and then I found a book in a used bookstore, Robert Wang's the Jungian Tarot. And then I got obsessed, and for, I don't know, some number of, maybe even a year, it was a half an hour to an hour every day studying the tarot, throwing cards, reading books, whatever. And then eventually I started doing readings for other people, which is where you really learn how to knit this stuff together, because it's a slightly pressured scenario, right? It's got this limit on it where, like, you you're trying to not excuse me, not tell somebody what they want to hear, but you want to make it engaging for them, and you want to be able to express fairly complicated things in a very simple format, so it conveys to them. So
Mm.
putting it in that pressure cooker of giving readings to other people really made me, like, strike up all these connections between things that I hadn't had before. So yeah, and it, for me personally, why it got so exciting was it. I say this sometimes to people, like, it always works. Um, and I don't totally understand why. And that to me is just a mystery worth exploring. Why does this work? Why does it, how, how metaphysical do you have to get to accept that this works?
So what does
So
working
yeah,
mean?
working to me means you see the cards, and it tells you something. It articulates something about your life that you couldn't quite articulate until that moment.
Right, right.
So I don't really go in for, when I do a reading, I don't really tell the future. I think there are people out there who have that ability. I don't, and I don't try to. But though I say that, and there are things in a reading that will look to the future, but it's not predicting what's going to happen. It's more like, um, it's more like, if your friend has had too much to drink and he's going to get into his car, why do you stop him? You don't stop him because he's definitely going to get into an accident. You stop him because he's kicking off a sequence of steps that could go very badly. And one of those things is an accident, or, God forbid he hurts somebody, right? So it's more like that. It's like, here's what is being set up and what to be cautious of once you've set that up. So working is, to me, it's just, if it forces some kind of recognition on somebody's part about what's actually happening to them, in
Mm.
them. Yeah.
So one of the things that I find interesting about tarot, or just divination, period,
Hmm.
is that it seems to be an acceptance that there are limits, and that it's not all free will, or somehow you're just going to be that unique individual.
Mhm.
In German they have the word Ausnahme, which is the exception. And one of the things
Mm.
Freud was very good on is the fantasy that everybody wants to be the exception to the rule, right?
Mhm.
And so in my rather shallow but nonetheless over time has gathered some perhaps dust of tarot is, what interests me a lot about it is the sacred geometry stuff and
Mhm.
the limits that imposes, because there's a math, and also the cards are numbered and so forth. So I wonder to what
Mhm.
extent you would agree with that, to what extent you've looked into the numbered and the geometrical foundations of it.
Yeah, I have looked into the numbered aspect of it, and maybe to a lesser degree the geometric aspect. I'm trying to get a deeper grasp on the Kabbalah. I have a sort of a very novice understanding of the Kabbalah as it relates to tarot, and I'm trying to get deeper into that. Um, um, the one thing that's interesting about the tarot is it's like it it operates on a lot of levels. So you can you can have a reading and each card is just a few keywords, and that'll quote unquote work.
Mm.
um and you can also have a reading that brings in the Kabbalah, brings in numbers, brings in astrology, brings in all of these other things, and that also works.
Mm.
And I refer to sometimes, there's a sort of a reading you might get at a Renaissance festival. I don't know if you've got those where you are.
I
That's a
haven't
that's
seen
a
one
place you
yet,
can
but
go. Okay, okay. There's a big one here in Michigan, and you go and people dress up in like Renaissance era. It's very anachronistic, but it's fun, and it's a place you can get a tarot reading, right?
mm.
So there's that, but they're pretty straightforward because they're trying to give a bunch of readings in a day to just anybody who walks by. And then there are levels to this, and they all kind of work on their own terms. So usually when I give a reading for somebody, I kind of gauge, like, are they trying to learn about the tarot generally as well as get a reading, or they just want a reading? And
Mm.
so I try to get a feel for that, and that's kind of how deep we go
Right,
in
right.
a spread. Yeah.
I think my stopping point with it really is that I never know what to ask. Like I just don't feel like I have questions for it.
Oh,
So,
interesting. Okay. Yeah.
am I missing something? Like I saw
You,
you a very compelling idea. Actually, you tweeted maybe you do a course on the use of the tarot in writing fiction. Now that to
yeah.
me seems like an interesting thing, because that's a little more interesting than maybe Chat GPT. What
Right. Right.
I've got three characters in a scenario. What should
Right.
happen?
Right. Yeah. 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 Well, maybe you don't have any questions because you're a reasonably well put together psyche. It's possible, right? Um,
Possibly.
see, it seems, well, from what I've seen, that could very well be the case. And I think that's probably true of other people too. They're not quite sure what to ask. And I give readings for myself, and they're usually fairly open-ended. In terms of like what my question is, it's usually just a word with a
Mm,
question mark at the end of it. And that keeps it fairly flexible. What I have found is that if your question is too specific, what the reading ends up being about is about what's going on with you that you asked that question,
mm,
more so than it is sort of some kind of advice on that question. Like I'm in various tarot groups on the internet, and I kind of just lurk in them, and I see a lot of um, young women usually who have a spread that's like it's about a boy, it's about a guy that they like, right? and
right.
and you see what it is, and I as soon as I see it, it's like what the tarot is trying to tell you is to re-examine your whole relationship to this intimacy thing. It's not trying to tell you anything about him specifically. It's trying to tell you about you and why you're anxious about this. Not
Mm,
that it's wrong to be anxious about a romantic situation, but that's what the tarot is trying to tell you. um in terms of writing, it's brilliant because there's like deep, very well interconnected narrative patterns inside of the tarot that you can take advantage of as a writer.
right.
Um, and it takes some time to understand what's going on with them. But you know, uh, especially in the major arcana, if you're trying to write a story, the major arcana, the 22 cards that don't have they don't have suits, that is basically a alternate version of the hero's journey that we were talking about earlier. It's the fool's journey, and it similarly has a very very well structured narrative pattern to it, and one thing leads to another. And you can decide where your story takes place on the fool's journey. Maybe pick a card or two or three or four cards. I'll tell you right now, my novel I'm working on now is 4 cards in the fool's journey. And if you read it and didn't know the fool's journey, that's fine. You don't need to. But it helps me understand what is the process that's happening to this person, right? And just to give you like a quick example, like if I pick 3 cards in the major arcana, let's say I pick strength, then the hermit, then the wheel of fortune. Strength might be a character learns how to control some aspect of their lives, of themselves, of the people around them, whatever. They've finally come to some point where they have some kind of fortitude, and they use that fortitude to like they use that fortitude to sort of step away from the world, right? They've become strong enough in themselves that they can kind of step away from the world and figure out who they are for a minute. So you might imagine a person does the hermit. They go up to a mountain, right, to seek wisdom. That would be a very simple version. And then the Wheel of Fortune is the next card. And part of the Wheel of Fortune is about understanding how the world works. That, there's things happen, good things happen, and then bad things happen. And it's not necessarily tied to what you deserve or anything. It's just that the world, there is a aspect to how fate plays out that just is. And so you imagine this character, they get this bit of wisdom and they come down and now they see how the world works. And, that's thus spoke Zarathustra. That's countless numbers of stories, right?
Yeah.
So you could pattern something just on that part of the fool's journey. And yeah, the tarot's, there's an, endless number of combinations that you could do like that.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
So you use the phrase, what the tarot wants to tell you.
Yeah.
Do you have, and I ask this without judgment, even though I'm biased in a particular way, which I will just happily share. But do you think the tarot is a thing that has a want to tell you, so to speak? Or do you think that it's, more like I was saying before, like a revelation of limits that just somehow are part of the way that the universe works? It's symbols and shapes, they recombine and they map in our minds. And
I think I'm always careful when I'm giving a reading for somebody to make sure that I'm not trying to get any like dogma to them. Like, this is what is happening. It's like, these are, as far as we know, these are random, right? But for me, I do at least like make an analogy, because it's easier for me to understand, to get my head around that it is like a thing that's talking to me. And to say that I believe it's a thing, that's a little trickier. It's the way that I think about it is like, there's nothing more complicated than a human being, right? With a mind. I don't know much. It's very difficult to come across something more complicated than another person, right? And so to me, whatever's going on in the tarot is so complicated that it makes more sense for me to use the model of a mind. That way I can get my own head around it. Because the human mind is the most complicated thing that I can even attempt to understand. So it's useful for me to think of it that way. Whether it actually is, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know ultimately either, but I find that these are almost the most pressing questions of our time. People are tearing themselves apart because they believe words in a book mean a thing, right? And
right.
So
it's true.
I get quite concerned about that, frankly.
Sure,
especially when some of the world's leading atheists are now converting to religion, and it's just like, you know that you're doing that because the power of the symbol, this particular symbol is more
Mm.
like lightsaber, whatever color is the good color in
Right, right.
Star Wars. You have Star Wars in House of Sleep, actually, now that I
Oh
think of
yeah,
it.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
you know, to me, and I don't know, I haven't talked to Ion Hersey Ali, but you know, like it just seems like there's like a something inauthentic about choosing this side of the symbol
Hmm.
world and
Hmm.
the metaphorical world as opposed to the other one, you know, in
Yeah,
order to preserve the
yeah.
species as if
Right, right.
you know, but in any case, maybe
We,
maybe we can find a question if you would, if I put you on the spot and you could
sure,
share a sample of your wares, even if it's just like
sure.
a one card reading,
Yeah, yeah.
and
We can do that. I'm gonna shuffle a little bit.
and
Yeah. What could?
correct the
Oh,
question so that I
okay,
know more, or that we know more about like what would be a question that's
okay.
doable and maybe one that doesn't reveal our anxieties. Well, one
Yeah,
thing, and
yeah.
I don't have it as a question, but one thing that I'm also very cautious of around the tarot is that I know how gullible I am and how influenceable, is that a word?
Right.
That I am,
Yeah.
how
Sure.
easily influenced I am. And
Hmm.
I mean, this is one of the things I'm writing about in my current fiction project, just as a preview for people who are watching this that know my previous novel, is
Hmm.
the whole idea of what if your brain is so powerful that it's like there's a thing called the egregore. Have you ever heard that?
Hmm. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like, what if what if you actually come to your belief actually causes you to lead yourself to make things true that aren't true, but they're true by virtue of your susceptibility to it, which is like Darren Brown kind of stuff. And
Right. Right.
in a
Right.
way, that is what using memory techniques is, right? Like someone says to you, look, if you build this room in your mind based on the room that you're in, and then you
Mhm.
want to remember the term major arcana, then you know you have like an archer in there, and like you know,
Right.
and you
Right.
really actually have to believe that it's possible that you're going to remember the word arcana because you have an archer with your friend Anna, you know, and then
Mhm.
that sort of thing. Like
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
it actually requires some buy-in, and then you make it real. It really does help
Right.
you.
Right.
So
Well, in most, in my experience, most things that are worth doing require at least like this small leap of faith,
mm,
right? Like you don't have to buy into some cosmological concept, right? But some like even the tarot, like I've read for very rational friends, right? Like people who make a living as research scientists, and
mm,
like the thing that I tell them is it's like if you just sit there with your arms crossed, it's not gonna work. You have to like you have to at least accept the fact that maybe this will tell you something. Just make that
right.
little step with me, and then we can go. But I think that's true. That's true with these techniques. If you don't, if the whole time you're like, this isn't gonna work. There's no, there's then it doesn't. And is that kind of woo woo? I don't think so. I think that's part of just how our minds are. We have to sort of fool ourselves a little bit to start with. It's like you need that to start the engine. Is
Mm,
like a little bit of a. I refer to like the writing process as delusional. You have to like convince yourself that this is worth doing
right, right.
because
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
kind of hard to
well,
say if it is. If I was rational about it, I would probably say it's not. You know, but
especially when you know there's a high likelihood that you'll write 200, like 100,000 words, 120,000 words, and you yourself won't even want to read it.
right, right, exactly. And then all that time and like, oh man, if you don't have like a slightly delusional belief that it's worth it, it's going to be a struggle.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I'm pretty well shuffled. So, do you want to have do you
Yeah,
have a
I
sort
mean,
of a
my general
question?
question is, and again, like you have full reign to like correct the
Okay,
question if it's not
sure.
one, but it is obviously going to reveal what's on my mind here.
Hmm.
I'm thinking a lot of people ask me about tarot. They ask me about astrology, you know,
Hmm.
numerology and all that sort of stuff. And I really don't, I can tell them generally, like, yeah, it's information. Here's how you would, you know, you got this chart. And so you got the symbol of, say, Mercury here or something like that. And then you got the house of Atreides this. I'm thinking of
Right.
Dune that run, but
I like that.
whatever. Like all these words on charts and diagrams and ascendant this and the symbol for the sun with the dot in it. And like how do I memorize all that? And I just wonder the extent to which am I going to be doing a service by actually memorizing some of that stuff myself, knowing just how many variations on a theme there are? Or is it really better to just continue with my orthodox, uber atheist non-duality? If non-duality is true, like Buddha is basically talking about before or after the 13th monk, let's say, where basically he says there's no net like delusion.
Right.
And it's just like,
right.
you're screwed either way, man. Your brain is just going to cook up whatever. But like, if I'm like if I just stick with my true non-duality, which is there is no separation, period. And if you're going to say there's a separation, then you're going to say that you have free will. And I just like, go with it. So that's like the general question: do or do not.
Okay. Yeah. Let's think. I like this, but yeah, let's see if we can refine it slightly. Just kind of narrow it slightly. Like, what is a word for? Do we have a word that's for like the astrological stuff like mysticism? Like, what would be a word that you might apply to that generally?
Mysticism's a good one. Someone suggested to me, she said, why don't you change your channel to the Memory Mystic? Because you're all about Bruno and like all this stuff. And I just think, thank you, but I don't think you understand Bruno. Like Bruno didn't even believe that people existed. He didn't believe in he was so non-dual. So like people think he's pantheistic. I don't think this is in Bruno. He's like, what are you talking about? You want to burn me at the stake because I said Jesus wasn't the Son of God? I don't even think he's a person. Right. Like I don't even think people are real. Like the whole idea of the ego. Right. So I'm not.
Okay.
I am also mystic. I think is the right word, maybe. Okay. But I am so far from mysticism. Like it's just like, are you kidding me? Like I don't even think I exist.
Right. Interesting.
Insofar as neuroscience and ego formation. Constantly this, that, and the other
interesting
thing.
So let's think. Well, okay, so we're kind of asking the question, is we're thinking about, should it be the memory mystic or what would be the alternate term?
Anthony.
Okay. Yeah, so I think because I like to avoid sort of yes or no questions, so I'm thinking about a way to phrase this. It's well, let's just say memory mystic question mark.
Yeah.
And we kind of both know what we're thinking. We're thinking there. Let me give it one more shuffle while we think about that word or that phrase or that question. Memory mystic. Give it one more good shuffle, and then we'll do a quick 3-card reading. That was not a good bridge. You gotta do it. You gotta do it on a good bridge.
Okay. Yeah.
Or else you're tempting fate.
I'm tempted to get into all kinds of procedural questions, but maybe that's things you can talk about with clients who might hop on.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, yeah, I'll tell you the spread. So the spread is what I call the beginning. It's usually referred to as a past, present, future, but I don't like, again, I'm not predicting the future. So what I prefer is a beginning, middle, and end reading, which means we're telling a story. We're telling a story about memory mystic. Okay. So, and we actually start with the middle because the middle is sort of a psychological cross section. This is like right now, what is this about? Right. And I'll explain that more because it'll slightly depend on what card shows up, what we're going to do with that. So the card you've got is the 2 of Cups. So quickly, cups, there's 4 suits in tarot, just like in a poker deck. Cups are, in the Jungian model, cups are about the unconscious. Sometimes people would refer to it as feelings or emotions. So it's water, right? That's what goes into a cup. I like to think of the cup as, the most relevant thing about a cup is what you put into the cup or what is in the cup. And I like to think about it as, do you know how people, when they struggle with various addictions, they will say, oh, I felt like I had a hole and I kept trying to put, name their thing in that hole, right? I think about the cup, that void, as that hole. something maybe we all have to varying degrees, and we try to heal it. We try to put stuff in it. Some stuff's not very good to put in there. Other stuff is perfectly fine to go in there. So the Two of Cups is you got these two people, a man and a woman, coming together, and they've each got a cup in their hands. So now this could, in a different reading, this could be about literally, romance, right? In here, I think what we're seeing, we've got a man and a woman. Not to get too gendered about it, but male, masculine, and feminine has a meaning in the tarot that doesn't have anything to do with what a
Definitely
given
when you're wearing leopard
person
print.
is. Right. Yeah, right. Yeah,
It
it's a
definitely
little,
has
yeah, that's
another
it's
dimension.
right. Yeah, bold choice.
I actually want to see what it
Yeah,
looks like in my deck
yeah, I
as
would
you
be
speak.
interested. You have a Marseille deck, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so it'll probably just be, I think it'll just be two cups on there,
yeah. That's what I
I
think.
believe.
It won't be
Yeah.
nearly as exciting.
Yeah. So yeah, Pamela Coleman Smith, who we had, by the way, quick plug, Art of Darkness. We did a whole episode on it. Pamela Coleman Smith was the artist behind the deck I have, and so she was one of the first people to actually put scenes on the minor arcana cards. So anyway, in this context, this card, I think what we're talking about is bringing two sort of energies together. And when I say energies, we're thinking about the masculine and the feminine. In the tarot, masculine is about what's oh yeah. So two, that's a beautiful deck.
Mm. Yeah, the
Yeah,
colors are
yeah,
very rich.
yeah, yeah, very strong. Yeah, I like it. Um, so I think what we're seeing here, masculine is about to put it briefly, think about what's happening in the creative process. Like the masculine pushes energy out and the feminine cultivates that energy into something
Mm.
useful, right? And so this is coming together to do those things. So what I see in terms of our question, and in normal cases I wouldn't even want to know the question, but this is fun, so it's fine.
Oh,
um
okay.
yeah. No, this is better because we can actually I think it makes better
Especially
for an
since
audience.
we're both internet people, because that's ultimately what it has to do with
Yep, exactly,
in many
exactly.
ways.
Yep. So what I think about here in terms of the question is, um, the masculine would be probably also the more, and again, I have to walk carefully here in current era. The masculine is going to be a little bit more about doing, right? So a little bit more about the task and the making things happen,
Mm.
which sounds like somewhat more of the non-mystic aspect. And the feminine is going to be more about the more ethereal, more interior aspect. And so this to me is telling us it's about trying to figure out a way to bring these two things together so they can share what's in each other's cups. They both sides have something equally valuable and powerful to them. And if there's a way that we can form a communion between them, that's what's
Mm.
going on. That's what's going on here. So, okay, two more cards quickly. Because I can go on forever about
That
these.
is essentially the present.
Yeah,
A very
right.
good description.
Yeah, yeah. And this is another thing about about where it's sitting. This could be an encouragement about what you need to do, or it could be just an identification about what's happening. It could be either one of those things.
Mm.
Now, what's going to come before this card is what I call the beginning card. And what we mean here is what were the processes that led to this situation, right? Like what are the underlying, and so in a way, it's sort of like, um, sometimes I'm sure people in the audience have, some of them have been in therapy, and sometimes you have an issue and you realize like, oh, that actually goes back to some childhood thing. It goes back to something
Mm.
my dad said to me when I was 8 and some reason it bothers me now. We're thinking about that kind of beginning, middle, end, right? So this might tell us something about why we found ourselves in that situation. Okay. You have uh the Five of Pentacles. Just trying to make sure my finger wasn't covering something good. The
Right,
Five of
right.
Pentacles. And Pentacles, one of the other suits, Pentacles are the earth sign. They're about the actual sensory world that you live in. So a lot of times these are money readings related to finances in some way. But they can also be, things like education, things like social network, or relationships, and usually not romantic relationships, but more like, oh yeah, I love that deck. It's so beautiful. um and so uh the yeah, so it can be about that, and it can also be about what we actually do, behavior, what we actually do in the real world. And you and everybody else knows that we can have thoughts and feelings and intuitions about stuff, but those aren't always exactly what we actually do, right?
Mm.
So when I see this card, Five of Pentacles, what you've got here is a stained glass window, right? And you've got two sort of Christmas Carol type, very impoverished people. It's a winter night, right?
Victor
Um,
Hugo novel.
yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah, it's Les Mis. And they're walking by a church. And the one thing that I say about this card when I see it is, um, there is this notion of there's a there's an article I read years ago about, I think it was in like Outside Magazine, about this hike, this coastal hike this guy went on. And he just decided when it started, he went with very little gear. He went when it started, he decided that Providence was going to provide for him. And he was just going to see how this goes. And he decided he was just going to believe that. Um, Maybe that's a little bit silly, but it did work out for him, right?
Mm.
And so when I see this card, what I think of is there's always a when we're in the physical world and there doesn't seem to be the thing, everything that we need, right? And this could be, you know, we're starving to death in the extreme, but in the less extreme, it could be everything feels a little boring, right? You can always turn into some kind of church. They're walking beside a church, and if they turn into that church, they're probably going to get fed at least for the winter night. They're at least going to get through that single night. So what this suggests to me is like the whole reason there's a turn to mysticism might be because it feels like there's something in that church that we might be missing. There's something over there in that region that feels like it could complete whatever is going on. Okay. So then now the end card, whoops, these are the wrong way. The end card, the third card, is okay. Let's say in this card, we actually, hold on. I think I'm in reverse. Yeah. Okay. In the central card, the middle card, we had this suggestion of communion. Now, the end card is going to tell us, you know, maybe what will happen if we do have that communion. What are the kinds of things that could happen? Or what are like some of the issues we might run into if we were to perform this communion? And the card we have
Ooh.
is the five of cups.
There we
Yeah, the
go.
Five of Cups is about mourning and guilt and depression and remorse.
Mm.
Um, I guess I have to leave this one to you, Anthony, because this is where the card positioning is very open. It
Mm.
could be this is what happens if you do the communion. It could be what happens if you don't do the communion.
Yes.
And
This is the with great power comes great responsibility thing.
yes, yes.
Because I mean, I don't know if you've come across my TEDx talk or anything like that, but
Hmm. Hmm.
I have had the unusual experience of, you know, it's my fault because there's a scripting problem in that TEDx talk.
Hmm.
Did you say Five of Cups? There, yeah.
Five of
So
Cups. Yeah.
here it's
Hungry
a little
people with
a little
flowers.
less daunting too.
Right, 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 right.
But this is part of why I take so much care around this, because
Hmm.
people have sent me long like emails and so forth, uh, and I think they think that I have a turn to the spiritual when in fact
Mm,
all that adventure has done is like when I learned the Sanskrit phrases and all this stuff, is that's where I
mm,
came up with the idea of the uber atheist, right?
right.
So it's just like these guys are not only saying that there's no God, but they're
Mm,
saying that there's just everything all at once, and that if
mm,
there is such a God, then this is it, tat tvam asi, as they say in
mm,
Sanskrit.
mm,
And I feel
mm,
like this tremendous pressure that because of what I do triggers people to misunderstand what I'm trying to say, and it's ultimately
mm,
always my fault, because no
mm,
matter how I say it, there's going to be somebody who misunderstands it, in the same way that, you know, you're not going to deny an interpretation I make of House of Sleep, because it's like everything's interpretable. Words can mean multiple things, even if they're synonymous, right? So that's a very interesting outcome.
Well, and I mean, this is the other thing too. Is
but I want the card that gives the decision, so
right.
the Empire can strike back.
That's what you want. That's what you want, is the thing to say, this is what you should do, and it's never going to do that. And partially, this is part of the thing too, where I may have overread some impressions I have of you into this because I know the question, right? And so maybe there's a part of me who I think, for my own reasons, that leaning into the mystical thing is good, right? And so because I know that question, I'll start to even subconsciously kind of change how I read these because of that. So this is why you need to, as the person the querent, as we would call you need to come with a certain kind of thoughtfulness. And I like that your reaction to it, because I think there's even more here than we might originally suppose. I mean, it could be that what needs to happen here in the communion is that we're going to have two sides of ourselves come together, and we're going to kind of share to some degree what's in each other's cups. But it might be, hey, make sure that this is the appropriate balance, right? It's not all one person's cup or the other. It might be, I mean, there's definitely that angle to it. And there's also the we're going to do this in a sort of spirit of sharing. Like, it could be the idea that including some measured mystical content will draw some people in who may find value in the other stuff you do, right? So it could be something along those lines as well. Yeah.
No, that's very good. And I think that's a great demonstration of how that it all works. And it is that sort of thing where we have to play along with it. Like, if we're not going to engage in it, it's not going to do anything. It'll just be, some discussion or what have you. But when you're willing to project into it, then it obviously is going to reveal. And that's part of the genius of the tarot. That's why it has that's
why it works.
Persisted. Yeah, that's why it works. But I appreciate
and
that.
this is and that's another thing that's great. Like, this is another thing, if somebody out there wants a reading, find me. Part of the reason also to not keep the question kind of secret is so there's always going to be like a little part, as somebody who's getting a reading, there's always going to be a little part of you who is skeptical and probing about whether this is all BS or not. And actually having that that gap where, say, me as the reader doesn't know, it kind of forces you into this position where you're like, well, he doesn't have any idea what I'm actually asking about. So if anything sticks out here at all, then there is something going on. It almost allows people to buy in more. So it's interesting, and not to try and trick anybody, but literally, like, just to try and invite people into the process of figuring out what these things are saying.
I think it's can be, when used with caution and a little bit of know thyself. Well, actually, now that I say know thyself, I might as well put a cherry on that, because a lot of people just think know thyself and but really what that meant in the ancient Greek tradition was know thyself relative to the forms.
Oh, okay.
And this specifically means the form of the good, and the perfect pictures in that space of the good, which we now would call like heaven or whatever, but it wasn't necessarily that. But a lot of the Platonic and then the Neoplatonic stuff is like the progress, the hero's journey or the fool's journey towards that place where all things are perfect and good. Anybody could read this in Plato's, it's in the Republic even, this journey of ascendance to that place. And so know thyself is never just like, oh, know who you are. It's know who you are relative to the forms. And there are particular characteristics. Now, those characteristics are not necessarily the tarot, but in terms of sacred geometry, they are things like an ellipsis. They are things like a dodecahedron. They are things like we saw with the pentacles there, with the pentagram,
Mhm.
like all those kinds of things are the forms. And if you know thyself relative to the rules that govern essentially their era of physics, then you're going to be much more able to navigate the world and
Mhm.
just do better generally. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
since we probably have like double, if not triple, depths of insight in our thinking because we're internet people and kind of know that
Mhm.
what it's like to have an audience and those kinds of responsibilities and duty of
Mhm.
care. And then also just
Mhm.
because you wrote a really great book, and
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
I really appreciate getting to hang out with someone who can sling a sentence like no other.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah, this has been a blast. Yeah.
cool. So
Yeah.
people can find you on Art of Darkness podcast.
Artofdarkpod.com. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And your site is
Yeah. My
your
site is
name.
Brad Kelly. That's with one E, Brad Kelly esque, ESQUE.com. Yeah, and so you
Okay.
can find short stories. Got a bunch of short stories there. You can find out more about House of Sleep. There's links to Art of Darkness, but also I've been on some other podcasts, so you can find all of that there. Also, I have some writing on the tarot. I've written. They're a little. They're not exactly maybe what your first go-to would be on card interpretations, but they're sort of essays about individual cards. I think there's 12 of them up there now, and I will be adding to those over time. So if you're interested in the tarot, if they're kind of a cool refraction of what's going on there.
Perfect. Well, thank you
Yeah,
again, and hope to do this again sometime.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you
Perfect.
so much.
Many thanks to Brad Kelly for joining us on this episode. I highly recommend you give House of Sleep a read and look him up on bradkellys.com if you want to be read by him in terms of the tarot, or you want to check out the Art of Darkness podcast. Now you're in the know, so make it so. Now, in terms of sharing things I'm reading, I want to add a feature to this show, which is what I'm reading now. And turns out that I'm going to be on the Art of Darkness, or at least that's the plan, to talk about something really interesting in memory, which is stand-up comedy, and particularly around the darkness in someone named Bill Hicks. So what I'm starting to reread is this wonderful book and some other texts about Bill Hicks that have emerged, and we're going to talk about what kind of memory issues and themes are involved in recalling stand-up. I think it's a very, very important and fascinating thing, something I'm working on myself in a very loose way. And I've thought before about basing one of my memory detective novels on a comedian, and thought a lot about using Bill Hicks as a reference point. So I'm very, very excited about that. So if you want to know when that's coming up, you're going to want to look at the Art of Darkness podcast and get subscribed over there. It really is a very interesting show, very well done, especially if you like to think in multiple dimensions about things. And you'll get a memory workout out of it, because when you're reading novels and then or any piece of art, movies, music, and you start to have discussions about them or listen to other people discuss them, you're getting a great memory workout, because little things that have entered your brain start to fire off and you go, oh yeah, I do remember that little point, that little detail, and I didn't know that it connected so widely. So there's my pitch for getting in touch with their show, Art of Darkness, whether I am on it or not, but I think that's the plan. And I do highly recommend House of Sleep. I think it was one of my favorite books of last year, not just because I'm biased about memory, but because it really is focused on the theme of memory in a way that gives me a wonderful excuse to talk about it, and with the author, who is an incredible author, in fact. And if you care about the nature of language, and you care about someone actually putting language to the service of an interesting plot that says something about the experience of reality, and in this case, how the reality of memory is experienced, then you're going to want to read House of Sleep. Thanks again for joining me. Until we have a chance to meet again, come visit me at magneticmarymethod.com and keep yourself magnetic.